Amanda Vale always told her students, "There are no perfect rehabilitation stories in correctional psychology." For the past 23 years, she has repeated this phrase like a mantra in Columbia University classrooms, at conferences, and in the hallways of Lakewood Prison. Always believed in those words. Until I met him. The first entry about Hugo Blackwell appeared in her professional diary on March 13, 2016. She still kept that tattered notebook in the bottom drawer of her desk, though she'd long ago switched to digital notes. March 13th. New patient, HB, 32 years old, sentenced to 9 years for aggravated assault. Initial assessment: high intelligence, controlled aggression, tendency to rationalize violence, denies the need for psychological help, believes his act was justified. Quote, "I was protecting what was mine." Interesting caveat, used the word what rather than whom when referring to his wife. Patterns of possessiveness need to be explored. Amanda remembered that day so clearly, the overcast March morning when the guards had brought him into her office. A tall, trim man with attentive gray eyes, who looked not at her, but through her. He had neatly trimmed dark hair with sagebrush at his temples and pianist's hands. Long, thin fingers that he kept interlocked at all times, as if he was afraid of what they might do if he let them go. "I'm Dr. Amanda Vale," she introduced herself then. "I know who you are," he replied calmly. "I don't need any help. I'm perfectly fine." That day they had just talked about formalities, about prison conditions, about the rules of their sessions. But even then, something in his demeanor caught her attention. Blackwell was far too calm for a man who had just received 9 years in prison. He seemed resigned but not broken, a rare state for new arrivals. An entry from April 6th. HB finally started talking about the incident. It is interesting that he describes his attack on the restaurant customer who drew attention to his wife in terms of surgery. "I just removed the problem. The lack of an emotional component to the story is alarming. Ordered additional testing." In the third session, she asked him to talk about his wife. "Natalie is the best part of me," he said then, and for the first time, Amanda saw some emotion on his face. "She teaches English literature at the college. We met at a William Faulkner book launch. She came over and corrected my pronunciation of the author's name." He smiled, staring into the emptiness in front of him. "Did she promise to wait?" Amanda asked. "She didn't just promise," Hugo answered with absolute certainty. "She will wait. It's out of the question." Something in the tone of his voice made her take note. Perhaps this was the first sign she should have noticed. By June 2016, their sessions had fallen into a regular pattern. Blackwell proved to be the perfect patient, punctual, thoughtful, cooperative. He did all the prescribed anger management exercises, wrote detailed reports of his thoughts and feelings, and actively participated in group therapy. June 28th. HB is showing considerable progress in his anger management program. Today, for the first time, correctly identified the triggers of his aggressive behavior. Quote, "I can't stand it when someone looks at mine as if it belongs to them." There's that theme of possessiveness again. It's important to explore. Letters from Natalie came every week, thick envelopes filled with small handwriting. Hugo never showed Amanda their contents, but always came to the sessions after receiving another letter in high spirits. "She describes to me the books she's reading," he recounted, in detail, page by page. "It's like reading together. Sometimes I close my eyes in the cell and can visualize us sitting in our living room with cups of tea, and she's reading aloud." This ability to visualize and empathize seemed like a good sign to Amanda. She noted in her notes the potential for restoring family relationships and reintegrating into society. Second anniversary of incarceration. HB demonstrates stable behavior and consistently applies cognitive regulation techniques. Today shared his post-release plans. "I want to teach math. I have a degree that I've never used. Natalie says her college always needs good teachers." The plan is realistic and constructive. As the years passed, Amanda watched Hugo Blackwell transform from a troubled inmate into a model of rehabilitation. He began helping in the prison library, started a math club for other inmates, even participated in a mentoring program for young offenders. In their 4th year, Their first truly disturbing alarm occurred, which she, to her shame, interpreted incorrectly. Natalie had missed one weekly letter, just one, in 4 years. When Amanda arrived for their session, Hugo sat motionless, with a perfectly straight back, staring at one point. His fingers weren't interlocked as they usually were. Instead, they were tapping out some complex rhythm on his knee. "Her letter was gone," he said in lieu of a greeting. "For the first time in 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days. "Maybe there was some problem with the mail," Amanda suggested. "No," he cut her off. "The letter didn't arrive because she didn't send it." His voice remained steady, but his fingers tapped out faster and faster. "How do you feel now, Hugo?" she asked, using the technique of direct appeal to emotion. "Nothing," he answered after a pause. "Absolutely nothing. Just waiting for an explanation." Amanda noted in her diary, "Possible episode of emotional dissociation as a defensive reaction to stress. Need to monitor the situation." The following week, the letter arrived. Natalie apologized for the delay. She'd been in a minor accident and spent 2 days in the hospital with a concussion. "Nothing serious," she assured him. "She just hadn't had a chance to write." Hugo's reaction reassured Amanda. He seemed genuinely concerned about his wife's condition and remorseful about his thoughts. "I thought the worst," he admitted. "Figured that she was sick of waiting." "It's a natural reaction," Amanda assured him. "The fear of loss is heightened in the face of separation." "Yes," he agreed, regaining his usual calm. "You're right. It won't happen again." And indeed, it didn't. Natalie wrote with the same regularity as before, and Hugo continued to show progress. He had been placed on light duty and allowed additional visits. From the record for the year 2021, HB discussed the subject of forgiveness today. Quote, "I forgave myself for what I had done, not for the action itself, it was necessary, but for putting Natalie through the stress and separation." An interesting formulation, reflecting the still present rationalization of violence, but with signs of empathy for his wife. In the last year before his release, Amanda began to notice a change in his attitude toward Natalie's letters. Whereas before he had simply informed her of the main topics of their correspondence, now he began to read out entire paragraphs, analyzing every word, searching for hidden meanings. "Don't you find it odd that she mentions her colleague's name 3 times in one letter?" he once asked. "Perhaps that person is just part of her daily life," Amanda replied. "What were those mentions about?" Jeffrey helped prepare a presentation. Jeffrey offered an interesting interpretation. Jeffrey thinks first-year students should read more of the classics. "Sounds like a common reference to a coworker," she remarked. "Yeah, I guess so," he agreed after a pause. "It's just that she hasn't mentioned other men so often in her letters before." Amanda noted this point in her notes, but didn't give it much thought. She wrote it off as natural anxiety before reuniting with her wife after such a long separation. 3 months before his release, Hugo began to show signs of increased anxiety. This seemed normal. Many prisoners experience fear of re-entry into society. They devoted several sessions to discussing his expectations and fears. "She's changed," he once said, looking at the last letter. "That's natural," Amanda replied. 9 years is a long time. You've both changed." "No." Hugo shook his head. "I am the same. I've kept myself for her. And she uses different words. She used to always sign off with 'forever yours.' Now it's just with 'love.'" He said it as if he had discovered proof of treason. "Hugo," Amanda said softly, "language and expressions change over time. It doesn't necessarily mean a change in feelings." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. The same smile that had always convinced her of his progress. "Of course, Dr. Vale, you're right. I am too vain." A month before Blackwell's release, Amanda prepared a final report for the commission. Prisoner Hugo Blackwell shows steady and significant progress in psychological rehabilitation. There have been no disciplinary infractions in 9 years of incarceration. Patient has successfully completed programs for anger management, impulsive behavior control, and conflict resolution. Has a clear and realistic plan for reintegration into the community, including employment and restoration of family relationships. The risk of recidivism is assessed as low. recommended for release on a time-limited basis with no further restrictions. Their last session took place 3 days before his release. He came into her office wearing the new clothes Natalie had sent. Dark blue suit, white shirt, tie. "How do I look?" he asked with a nervous smile. "Ready to start a new life," she replied sincerely. They talked about the practical aspects of his return, how to deal with stress, how to rebuild a relationship gradually, without rushing things. He listened intently, making notes in a small notebook, asking clarifying questions. At the end of their meeting, he extended his hand to her. "Thank you, Dr. Vale, for everything." His handshake was firm, confident. The gaze was open and calm. "There will be difficulties," she warned him. "That's normal. Don't forget the techniques we practiced." "I remember each one," he assured her. "Everything will be fine." Amanda watched him walk away down the hallway, straight back, confident gait. A model case of rehabilitation, a success story for her next textbook. In her journal she wrote, "Last session with HB, 9 years of work completed successfully. Patient shows all signs of readiness for reintegration. Supervisory appointment scheduled 1 month after release." Closing the diary, Amanda felt the satisfaction that comes with the realization of a job well done. Hugo Blackwell had been her professional triumph, proof that the system could work, that people could change, that even the most complex cases were correctable with the right approach. She could not have known that 3 days later, she would be rereading all her notes on him, desperately trying to understand where she had gone wrong, what signs she had missed, how she had allowed herself to be so fatally mistaken. The case of Hugo Blackwell taught Amanda the most important lesson of her career. Even the most experienced among us can be deceived, especially when we so desperately want to believe in success. The morning of May 23, 2025, was unusually clear. Amanda Vale woke up before her alarm clock, as she always did on days when one of her long-term patients left the walls of the correctional facility. In her 23 years of practice, she had developed a peculiar ritual for such days. 40 minutes of jogging in the park instead of the usual 30, a cup of strong green tea instead of the usual latte, reviewing all the final documents before signing. She believed that these small changes in routine helped her focus on the importance of the moment, the day when the result of her work was put to the ultimate test, the encounter with the world outside the controlled environment. At 7:30, she was already sitting at her desk in her Upper East Side apartment, reviewing the electronic version of the final report on Hugo Blackwell. Amanda reread her recommendations and findings one more time. Not a single disciplinary action in 9 years. Exemplary behavior, maximum scores on the professional training program, positive feedback from other correctional officers. "Hugo is my professional masterpiece," she thought as she took a sip of tea. It was rare for an inmate diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder with elements of obsessive-compulsive tendencies to show such results. If all of her cases ended so successfully, perhaps the recidivism statistics in their state wouldn't be so dismal. Amanda quickly gathered the paperwork into a leather folder and glanced at her watch. 8:15. She had just enough time to get to the prison by 10, the time when Blackwell's formal release procedures were to begin. She'd chosen a strict navy blue suit for the day, the color of confidence and professionalism. Over the years, Amanda had noticed that on release days, inmates were particularly attentive to detail, including the appearance of the staff. It was a day to be associated with order and security, not the chaos that often awaited them outside the gates. The drive to Lakewood took just under an hour. Amanda parked her silver Volvo in a familiar spot outside the administration building. As she greeted the security guards at the entrance, she felt the usual mixed feelings, pride in the work she'd done, and a slight worry about her patient's future. "Good morning, Dr. Vale." Harry said hello, an older guard who had worked here seemingly as long as she herself had. "Big day for your guy, huh?" "Yeah, Harry. Blackwell goes back out into the world today," she replied, trying to hide the note of pride in her voice. "If anyone's ready, it's him." The guard nodded. "I've never seen a man change so much while doing time." Amanda smiled, but didn't say anything back. Professional ethics prevented her from discussing her patients, even with her coworkers, unless it was part of a formal process. She spent another half hour in her office reviewing Blackwell's final reintegration plan. Housing, checked. He was allowed to return to the house Natalie had kept all these years. Employment, pre-approval from the local community college for a math teaching assistant position. Social support, weekly meetings with a group of ex-prisoners, monthly sessions with a psychologist in the community. Everything was ready. Everything had been thought through. And yet, Amanda felt a slight unease she couldn't explain. It wasn't professional doubt. Her assessment of Hugo's readiness was based on years of observation and dozens of tests. It was something else. Some intuitive anxiety she'd learned to ignore over years of working in a system that required objective data rather than subjective impressions. At 9:45, there was a knock on her office door. Standing on the threshold was Richard Stern, the prison's director, a tall, trim man with a military bearing and the same approach to running an institution. "Dr. Vale, ready to sign the final release?" he asked without preamble, holding out a folder of documents. "Good morning, Richard," Amanda replied, accepting the folder. "Yes, I just need to run through the last few items." The principal was in no hurry to leave, watching her scrutinize each page. "I see you didn't include him in the extended escort program," Amanda remarked as she reached the last page. "Resources are limited, Doctor. We need to focus them on those who are truly at risk," Stern replied, crossing his arms over his chest. "And you yourself have rated his risk of recurrence as low." "Yes, but extra support never hurts," Amanda countered, even though she knew she was losing this argument before it even began. Budgetary constraints always trumped professional advice. Blackwell got his due, 9 years of therapy at taxpayer expense. The director lowered his voice slightly. It's time he learned to stand on his own 2 feet. Amanda suppressed the urge to remind him that the purpose of the correctional system wasn't just punishment, but rehabilitation and a safe return to society. Instead, she simply nodded and signed her name to the document. "Thank you," Stern said dryly, picking up the folder. "Blackwell will be in the release preparation room at 10:30. If you'd like, you can be present for the release of personal belongings and the final briefing." "I'll be there," Amanda replied, not showing her disappointment at the outcome of the conversation. After the director left, she looked over her copy of Hugo's personnel file one more time. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew it was unnecessary. She knew his history by heart. Still, something compelled her to revisit the details of his crime again and again. 9 years ago, Hugo Blackwell had attacked a restaurant patron who, in his words, had been too insistent on getting to know his wife. The attack was swift and methodical, 4 precise blows resulting in serious injuries. The victim survived only thanks to the prompt intervention of other visitors. At the trial, Hugo was completely calm, pleaded guilty, and said he acted out of necessity. Something about this story had always bothered Amanda, though she couldn't articulate exactly what it was. Perhaps the contrast between the brutality of the attack and the subsequent 9-year history of exemplary behavior. Or maybe the fact that in all those years, Hugo had never once expressed real regret for what he had done, only for the consequences for himself and his wife. At 10:20, Amanda closed the file and headed for the release preparation room, a small room with gray walls where prisoners were returned their personal belongings and given a final briefing before release. Hugo was already there, sitting in a metal chair with a perfectly straight back. A paper bag containing his personal belongings lay on the table in front of him. He looked calm, almost serene, in the new suit his wife had sent him. The only sign of excitement was the barely perceptible rhythm his fingers tapped out on his knee. "Good morning, Hugo," Amanda said hello as she entered the room. He looked up and smiled, the same smile that always seemed genuine to her. "Dr. Vale, didn't expect to see you here. Thought we'd already said our goodbyes." "I wanted to make sure the release process went smoothly," she replied, sitting down across from him. "How are you feeling today?" "Strange," he admitted after a brief pause. 9 years is a long time. The world has changed. I've changed. I'm afraid I won't recognize him and he won't recognize me. It was exactly the answer Amanda had expected to hear, deliberate, reflective, showing an understanding of the difficulties ahead. And yet something in his tone made her inwardly tense. "It's a normal concern, Hugo. Remember our talk about the adjustment period? The first weeks will be the most difficult, but you have all the tools to cope." He nodded, his eyes pausing for a moment on the clock on the wall. "Natalie should be here by now," he said in a tone as if stating an undeniable fact. "Did you talk to her yesterday?" Amanda asked. "No, the last call was the day before yesterday, but she knows it's 11 o'clock today," he replied, and his fingers stopped tapping out the rhythm for a moment. "She's never late. That's one of the traits I appreciate in her. Punctuality." Something in the way he said the word appreciate, not love, not adore, but appreciate, caught Amanda's attention. But before she could continue the conversation, an officer entered the room with a clipboard. "Hugo Blackwell, please check the contents of the package and confirm that all of your personal belongings are in place," he said in an official tone. Hugo methodically pulled items out of the bag, arranging them on the table: a wristwatch, a leather wallet, a wedding ring, keys that were probably long gone, a cell phone from 9 years ago. He checked each item with a thoroughness that might have seemed excessive, but Amanda knew it was part of his personality, the need for control, for ordering his world. "Everything is in place," he confirmed, and the officer held out a clipboard for him to sign. As Hugo signed the paperwork, the officer began the standard briefing: conditions of parole, schedules for meetings with the probation officer, restrictions on interstate travel, rules for notification of changes of residence or employment. Blackwell listened attentively, nodding occasionally, but it was obvious from his face that he already knew it all by heart. After the formalities were completed, the officer walked out, leaving Amanda and Hugo alone. "There's not much left," she said, trying to diffuse the tension that had built up. "You'll be escorted to the main exit in 15 minutes. Hugo nodded, his gaze focused on the wedding ring he was twirling in his fingers. "Strange, it seems smaller than I remembered," he remarked. "I wonder if it will fit me now." He tried to slip the ring onto his finger, but it was indeed too tight, stopping at the middle of the phalanx. "My hands have gotten bigger." "Prison training," he said with a slight smile, but something flashed in his eyes that Amanda couldn't decipher. Disappointment? Anxiety? Anger? "You could take it to a jewelry shop to have it resized," she suggested. "Yeah, I guess so," he replied, dropping the ring into his jacket pocket. "Or buy a new one, start with a clean slate." That phrase, "start with a clean slate," sounded to Amanda like an echo of their many therapy sessions. How many times had they discussed the concept of a new beginning, the possibility of leaving the past behind and building a healthy future? And yet something about the way he said it now seemed out of place to her, as if it were a quote from a memorized text, rather than a sincere aspiration. "Hugo, I want you to remember, adapting takes time," Amanda said, leaning a little closer. "Don't expect things to get better instantly. Give yourself and Natalie a chance to get reacquainted with each other." He looked at her with an expression that could be interpreted as mild surprise. "Dr. Vale, you make it sound like Natalie and I are strangers," he said, and for a second his voice lost its usual softness. "We are husband and wife. 9 years apart doesn't change that fact." Before Amanda could respond, the door opened again and another officer entered. "Mr. Blackwell, your wife has arrived. She is waiting at the main exit. We are ready to complete the release procedure." Hugo stood up instantly, his face contorted. All the tension Amanda had noticed in his posture was gone, replaced by an almost boyish enthusiasm. "She's here," he said, and those two words were filled with so much emotion that Amanda felt a prick of doubt about her recent misgivings. Perhaps she really was being too picky, looking for problems where none existed. "This is your day, Hugo," she said, standing up and extending her hand to him. "I'm proud of the progress you've made." He shook her hand firmly, and his smile seemed completely genuine. "Thank you for everything, Dr. Vale. I won't forget what you've done for me." They left the room together and headed down the long hallway toward the main exit. Hugo walked confidently, his steps measured, as if he were trying to control his impatience. Amanda noticed the guards nodding at him, some even quietly wishing him good luck, an unusual display of sympathy in a place where professional distance was usually strictly enforced. As they approached the last checkpoint, Amanda saw through the glass doors the silhouette of a woman waiting outside. Even from a distance, it was obvious she was nervous, shifting from foot to foot, fixing her hair, checking the time on her wristwatch. There she is, Hugo pronounced, and his voice trembled. It was the first time in 9 years that Amanda had seen Natalie Blackwell in person, rather than in the photos in her personnel file. A slender woman with blonde hair gathered into a neat bun, dressed in a simple blue dress. She looked younger than her age. The file said she was 42, but you couldn't give her more than 35. Her face was tense but beautiful, with delicate features that made her look like the heroine of a Victorian novel. The last officer gestured for Hugo to come to the final checkpoint, where he was to sign the last document and receive official confirmation of release. "I'm not going any further," Amanda said, stopping at a respectful distance. "This is your moment, Hugo." He turned around, as if he wanted to say something, but changed his mind and simply nodded, then walked resolutely toward the checkpoint, where an officer was already waiting with the paperwork. Amanda watched the procedure with a mixed feeling of professional pride and anxiety that she couldn't quite suppress. At the last moment, before walking out the prison doors, Hugo turned and looked at her one more time. There was something strange in that look, as if he was trying to memorize her face or convey some silent message. Then the doors opened and Hugo Blackwell stepped through. Amanda continued to watch through the glass as he approached Natalie. The woman froze, her hands involuntarily raised to her face in a gesture expressing a mixture of joy and disbelief. Hugo approached her slowly, as if afraid to frighten her away. They stood opposite each other for a few seconds, not touching, just looking into each other's eyes, and then Natalie stepped forward and embraced her husband. Amanda saw Hugo's arms wrap around his wife's frail figure, his face buried in her hair. From the outside, they looked like an ordinary couple reunited after a long separation. Nothing in this picture foreshadowed what was to happen in a few seconds. Later, replaying the scene over and over in her mind, Amanda was never able to pinpoint the exact moment when the hug turned into something else. Maybe it was an imperceptible gesture to the unaided eye, the way his hands changed position on Natalie's back, or the way his shoulders tensed. Or maybe it was the momentary glimmer in his eyes when he looked up for a split second and looked over his wife's head, as if making sure Amanda was still watching. The blood had a distinctive tint to the light blue fabric. Amanda Vale had never thought about this fact before, but now this detail seemed permanently imprinted on her mind. Natalie Blackwell's dress was blue, the color of a cloudless sky, the color of hope. On it, the blood looked almost black. 3 days had passed since the tragedy, but Amanda still couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. Pale and gaunt, she sat in her office, hands clasped around her now cooled cup of coffee, staring at the papers spread out before her. 9 years of observations, assessments, notes, 9 years of mistakes. The phone call came when she was just about to reach her car in the prison parking lot. Reluctance to answer fought professional responsibility. Eventually, Amanda pulled the phone out of her bag. The number belonged to Lakewood's main entrance security. "Dr. Vale, you need to return to the checkpoint immediately." The guard's voice was tense with a hint of shock. "There's been an incident with Blackwell, his wife. She needs medical attention." As she rushed back toward the main entrance, a premonition of disaster overwhelmed her. The sounds of sirens grew louder and louder. The red and blue flashes of police flashers reflected off the walls of the building. And then she saw the body on the pavement and the paramedics leaning over it. A blue dress soaked in blood. Immobility that could only mean one thing. A few meters away, pinned to the ground by 3 guards, lay Hugo. His face, turned toward Amanda, expressed absolute calm. Their gazes met, and for a moment she thought she saw a smile flicker in his eyes. The same smile she'd considered a sign of progress all these years. "I just got back what's mine," he said so quietly she could barely make it out. But those words set off a chain of memories. His first phrase at their first session, recorded in her journal. "I was protecting what was mine." That, not who. She'd noted the caveat then, but hadn't given it much thought. Like 100 other little details that now surfaced in her mind, adding up to a mosaic she hadn't wanted or couldn't see before. Amanda flinched as the door to her office opened. Standing on the threshold was Diane Cole, a young police officer who had once interned under her in a law enforcement psychological training program. "I knocked, but you didn't answer," Diana said as she cautiously entered the office. She was in civilian clothes, but her police badge was visible on her belt. "How are you holding up, Dr. Vale?" I don't know," Amanda answered honestly, gesturing for her former student to sit down. "Everything seems unreal." "Yeah, it does to me too." Diana lowered herself into the chair across from her, her gaze sliding over the papers spread out. "I didn't just come to inquire about your well-being. I've been assigned an investigation. We need to understand what happened, and why." "It seemed pretty obvious to me," Amanda grinned bitterly. "Blackwell killed his wife, in front of a dozen witnesses. What kind of investigation can there be?" "We need to reconstruct the full picture," Diana explained patiently. "Understand the motive, the psychological background, find out if it could have been prevented. You were his psychologist for 9 years, Dr. Vale. No one knew him better than you. And as it turns out, I didn't know him at all." Amanda rubbed her temples, feeling a migraine coming on. "Tell me what you saw that day. Every detail," Diana asked, pulling out a small tape recorder. Amanda closed her eyes, going back to the events of 3 days ago. She detailed the last meeting with Hugo in the release preparation room, his behavior, the conversation about the ring getting too small, his calmness before meeting his wife. "I watched through the glass doors as he approached her," Amanda continued, her voice becoming almost mechanical, as if she were reading a report rather than describing the tragedy she had witnessed. "They embraced. It seemed normal, a normal reunion after a long separation, and then..." She fell silent, trying to gather her thoughts. "And then I saw his posture change. He said something to her. I couldn't hear what it was. She tried to pull away, but his hands were already clutching her neck. It all happened so fast. The guards reacted instantly, but it was too late. He snapped her neck in one precise movement, like he'd been practicing, like he knew exactly what he was doing. According to witnesses, he said something along the lines of, 'Now you're mine forever,'" Diana said after a pause. "Is that consistent with what you knew of his psychological profile?" Amanda nodded slowly, her gaze stopping on one of the notes in the open folder. "Obsessive fixation on belonging, wife as property rather than an equal partner. Need to work on that aspect." "Yes," she said quietly. "That is entirely consistent. I've noted his possessive tendencies from the beginning of our sessions, but I believed we had made progress on that point." "You couldn't have foreseen this, Dr. Vale," Diana said softly, but Amanda shook her head. "Don't console me, Diana. I should have seen it. All the signs were here right in front of me. I noted them, documented them, but I interpreted them wrong." Amanda thumbed through the notes, pointing to specific entries. "Here, his reaction when Natalie didn't send an email one time. He seemed perfectly calm outwardly, but his fingers were tapping out this strange rhythm. And here's his comment about Natalie's coworker, whom she often mentioned in letters. He asked me if it was strange. And then, the last months before his release, his obsession with changing the signature on her letters, from 'Forever Yours' to just 'With Love.' You think he planned this all along?" Diana asked. "No," Amanda replied after a long pause. "I think the decision came gradually. Perhaps he didn't fully realize it himself until the moment he saw her, but the foundation had been laid long ago. All these years he had been living an idealized image of their relationship. In his mind, Natalie was frozen in time, just as he remembered her, unconditionally devoted, completely belonging to him. But she waited for him for 9 years, came for dates, wrote letters every week," Diana observed. "Yes, but she was also living her life, developing as a person, building a career, making new acquaintances. For someone with narcissistic disorder and obsessive-compulsive tendencies like Hugo, that could have been perceived as a betrayal." Amanda looked up from the papers. "Did we find anything in their house? Any evidence to indicate pre-planning?" "Nothing concrete," Diana shook her head. "But they did find a strange diary in his jail cell. He kept a sort of catalog of changes in Natalie based on her letters and photos she sent, noting new words in her vocabulary, analyzing her handwriting, recording the slightest changes in her appearance. It looks obsessive." "I've never seen that diary," Amanda said quietly. "He never mentioned it. We talked about taking notes as a therapeutic practice, though." "One more thing," Diane added. We discovered that for the past 2 years, Blackwell had been working out regularly in the prison gym, especially grip and arm strength exercises. One of the inmates said that Hugo once mentioned how important it was to be able to solve problems quickly and efficiently. Amanda closed her eyes, feeling a wave of nausea surge up her throat. All these details added together painted a picture of methodical preparation, not spontaneous action, and she, a professional psychologist with 23 years of experience, didn't see it. "What did he say after the arrest?" she finally asked. "Very little," Diana replied. "Maintains the same calmness he had when he was apprehended. The only thing he repeats is, 'I have completed what I started 9 years ago.' He seems to think he has restored some form of justice." "That's consistent with his initial rationalization of violence," Amanda nodded. "When I asked him about the assault for which he got time served, he said he just deleted the problem. To him, violence is a rationalized tool of control." They talked for nearly 2 more hours, analyzing every aspect of the case, every detail of Hugo's psychological profile. As Diane got ready to leave, she stopped in the doorway and turned to Amanda. "Director Stern is resigning," she said. "He holds himself partially responsible for cutting the post-penitentiary follow-up program, for ignoring additional recommendations from psychological services." "It's not his fault," Amanda shook her head. "Hugo's been playing a double game this whole time. He was showing what we wanted to see: remorse, progress, a desire for rehabilitation, and underneath that mask lurked something else." "Still," Diana continued softly, "there will be a command investigation. You should prepare yourself for the fact that your work with Blackwell will be scrutinized." "I know," Amanda nodded, "and I will accept any consequences. Because at the end of the day, I do bear responsibility. I had to see." After Diane left, Amanda sat at the table for a long while longer, rereading her notes on Hugo Blackwell. She remembered their sessions, his smile, his attentiveness, his seeming eagerness to change how well he played his part, how skillfully he had manipulated not only the system, but her personally. In the corner of the desk lay a thin folder, a psychological profile of Natalie Blackwell, compiled by a specialist in working with prisoners' families. Amanda had never read this document before. It was not within her direct purview. Now she opened it, feeling she needed to know more about the woman whose death she couldn't prevent. Subject shows signs of codependent relationships and learned helplessness syndrome, she read. In conversations, often idealizes the spouse despite his violent behavior. However, in recent years has shown signs of increasing autonomy, developing a career, expanding social circle. The potential risk is the spouse's reaction to these changes upon release. Amanda closed the folder, feeling tears sting her eyes. Even that warning hadn't been heeded. The system meant to protect had failed to do its job, and she herself was part of that system. The next day, Amanda visited the morgue where Natalie Blackwell's body still lay awaiting burial. She stood in front of the cold metal table, looking at the woman she knew only from photographs and records. Natalie looked peaceful, almost asleep. The bruises on her neck were hidden by skillful makeup, but Amanda knew they were there, the marks of her husband's last hug. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. "I should have protected you. I should have seen." Later that day, she filed for a suspension pending an investigation. In a cover letter, she detailed all her errors in judgment of Hugo Blackwell, seeking no excuses, no attempt to mitigate her responsibility. That evening, sitting in her empty apartment, Amanda finally allowed herself what she had been holding back all these days, an all-consuming wave of grief and guilt. She cried, shaking with sobs, until she had no strength left even to cry. And then, wiping her face, she sat down at her computer and began writing a new risk assessment protocol for the state's correctional system. A protocol based on what she had learned at the cost of Natalie Blackwell's life. She called it Blackwell's Case, Markers of a Hidden Threat. In it, she detailed all the signs she had missed or misinterpreted: obsessive fixation on the past, lack of true remorse for violent acts, perceiving the partner as property rather than a person, special attention to language and wording, feigned acceptance of therapeutic goals without internal acceptance. The first paragraph of the document stated, "In correctional psychology, there are no perfect rehabilitation stories. Each case of apparent success must be examined with heightened attention to details that do not fit the big picture. It is in these minor inconsistencies that the truth often lurks that we are unwilling or unprepared to see. Finishing her work deep into the night, Amanda knew it wouldn't redeem her, wouldn't bring Natalie back to life. But perhaps it would help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Perhaps another psychologist reading these lines would pay attention to the very details she had ignored, and someone will be saved. Before shutting down her computer, she opened the last entry in her professional diary about Hugo Blackwell. Patient shows all signs of readiness for reintegration. Amanda chuckled bitterly. Professional blindness is perhaps the most dangerous affliction for those who work with human souls, especially when those souls skillfully conceal their true nature. The next morning, waking from a disturbing dream in which she saw the blue dress soaked in blood over and over again, Amanda made a decision. She wouldn't just take a break from work for the duration of the investigation. She would completely rethink her approach to her profession. Perhaps she should go back to teaching, to tell her students about her mistake, about the cost of self-confidence and professional hubris, about how dangerous it is to believe in your own infallibility, and that you really can understand another person completely. After all, the main lesson Hugo Blackwell taught her is that none of us truly see the other. We only see what we are shown and what we are willing to see. Everything else is hidden in the blind spots of our perception, and sometimes the cost of that blindness is exorbitant.